And so what I'd like to do is, I'd like to say a few words about what 1 through 5 are about, and then we'll take a look at chapters 1 and 2, and then we'll pick up 3 for next week. So remember the setting. It's 1941. The Germans are bombing England. C.S. Lewis is invited by the BBC to give a series of 5 15-minute radio broadcasts to the nation on Christianity. And of course, he has to make a decision about what he's going to say, right? He knows that he's living in an essentially post-Christian society. But as Lewis knows, is that if on his first broadcast, he says something like, don't you know that you all need to be going to your nearest Anglican church? The reaction is going to be, click. He knows that if he says, you know what, you're all sinners in need of God's forgiveness, click. You know that you're all a bunch of moral degenerates and you need to get your acts together, click. So the question that he is trying to deal with, right, is he's trying to figure out how to get these 5 broadcasts off to a start. So let's think about how he does it. Now, the task of a Christian apologist, this has been true ever since the beginning. Okay, this has been true since day 1. The task of a Christian apologist really is to help people see that Christianity helps us to make sense of the world that we live in, right? That is, the task of an apologist is to help people see that one of the great things about Christianity is it helps us to actually understand the world that we live in and who we are and the problems and issues that we face. And so that's Lewis's task here. And so what he does is he decides on 2 fundamental things. He decides that his point of departure is going to be our fundamental sense of right and wrong, what he calls the moral law. I'll be saying more about that in a few minutes. On this idea, right, if there's no fundamental order in the world, that means that all morality is simply, essentially invented and arbitrary, right? If there's no real moral order in the world, right, we could just might as well say, you know what, actually, killing other people is a really good thing, especially if you don't like them. Or, who the hell gives any concern at all about the poor? Let's let them go. They're not going to bother you. If there's no fundamental order in the world, then that basically means that all moral judgments are basically impossible, right? Without a fundamental order, making moral judgments is impossible. It'd be like refereeing a discussion between, a person who believes the color red's the best color in the world and somebody who believes the color green is the best color in the world. And it becomes a shouting match, right? Almost like watching a political show on cable television. So that's his beginning point, right? He's going to want to argue that unless there's kind of some fundamental order in the world that's beyond our own feelings and perceptions, then making moral judgments is going to be impossible. On the other hand, and here's where he's going to help us to go, right? On the other hand, if it's possible to somehow show that there is a fundamental order in the universe, if there is kind of like a fundamental right and wrong that's independent of what you and I like or want or think, if there is a fundamental order in the moral order in the universe, then we have to ask the question, well, where did that order come from? If we didn't think it up, if we didn't create it, it must come from somewhere outside ourselves. And that makes it possible to begin thinking about, well, just as our minds are capable of discerning moral principles and making moral decisions, maybe there's like a mind behind the whole universe. And that's where this moral order has come from. You see the strategy here, right? Lewis is trying to, this is where he's decided to begin. The second point that Lewis is going to make is, if we're honest with ourselves and if we kind of reflect on our own lives, we're going to discover that all of us fail to live up to this moral order all the time, right? That is, if we do any reflection on our lives, if we have any degree of self-awareness or honesty about ourselves, we're all going to realize that there are moments in our lives where we're both tempted to not live up to the moral order and where there are cases where we've actually yielded to that temptation. Okay? I notice this does not apply to any of you here. But some people do struggle with this, so we need to understand where they are, right? And if that's the case, right, if we find ourselves constantly falling short of this moral order, Lewis says, that leads us to the question, well, what are we to do? What are we going to do about that, right? So that's what Lewis is hoping to do with these first 5 series of broadcasts, is basically to get people thinking. Okay, now, I just want to underline why he's doing this. Lewis, I think, realized that living in a post-Christian culture, he had to face sort of 2 what you might call prejudices about Christianity. And, I think it's possible to say we find ourselves in a post-Christian culture now. Okay, so according to a widely reported survey that was done by the Pew Center for Religion and American Life, Pew Center survey concluded that somewhere about 20% of Americans identify themselves as having no religion. Not, I go to church infrequently, or not, I'm not really interested in church. I don't have a religion and I don't want one. That's expected to reach 30% sometime around 2035. So that's where we are, right? So there are two prejudices about Christianity that are sort of out there, and Lewis realizes that we have to deal with them. So let's take a quick look at the prejudices. Prejudice number 1, belief in God is irrational, right? Belief in God's irrational. There's no reason for it. It's superstitious. It's not founded in science. It's not founded in evidence. It's just something that occurs, and you can think up all kinds of explanations for it, but it's finally irrational. Doesn't make any sense, right? And so people who believe in God don't have any sense. That's one of their problems. They have other problems, but that's one of the ones. Second prejudice, or second assumption is, it kind of follows from the first, belief in God is not only irrational, it's also irrelevant. It has nothing to do whatsoever with anything that you and I are really concerned about or interested in. Like what's on television tonight, or what kind of coffee I'm going to have tomorrow. Those are the really important things, right? So once again, notice what Lewis is doing here. He's addressing both those questions. He's saying, you know what? If it's true that there is like a fundamental order, moral order in the universe, then we have to wonder where that order came from. And if this world was created by a good, perfect, and righteous God, a moral order is exactly what we would expect. So belief in God really isn't irrational. There's a real reason for believing. There's other reasons too, but this is one. And second of all, right, if morality isn't just a series of rules about do this and don't do that, but if morality actually is about us becoming actual, real, genuine human beings, then it's not irrelevant. Okay? If everything Lewis is trying to argue is true, belief in God is actually really, really rational and really, really relevant. That's what he's trying to do. Okay? Once again, in 5 radio 15-minute broadcasts on BBC. Okay, so we just want to appreciate how difficult this is. So let's take a look at Lewis's argument in chapter 1. I'll try and summarize it for you. Lewis begins with an observation, right? And anyone who has had children knows this, right? People argue with one another, right? They argue I remember, my mom and dad having what they called discussions. They never called them arguments. My mom and dad would have a discussion. But anyway, it's the same thing. And of course, when we have arguments about what we've done or what we're thinking about doing, right? Lewis says, that presupposes that somehow there's some sort of common standard of right and wrong that we can appeal to, okay? If person A and person B are arguing about some potential action that they're going to take, right? The argument presupposes that there's some kind of common ground or common standard that you can appeal to for there actually to be an argument, okay? If there's no common ground, if there's no common standard, argument becomes not only impossible, but irrelevant. Okay? Then you have to resort to something else, like a fist fight or something like that. And there are places where that's where you settle arguments, like the U.S. Congress or places like that. So that's where Lewis begins. And Lewis goes further and says, whenever we evaluate the behavior of other people, or when we try to justify our own departures from the moral law, right? Once again, that presupposes some common standard. Okay, if I promise to do something for you on Wednesday, let's say I promise to give you $100 on Wednesday, and I don't do it, which I probably wouldn't do. If I don't do it, right, what I'm going to probably do is I'm going to probably try to give you an explanation of why I didn't give you the $100, right? I'm not going to just say, well, you know what? I don't really care about promises. I make promises all the time with no intention of keeping them. You're a fool for believing me, right? Or something like that. No, what I'm going to say is, well, I actually had intended to give you $100, but then my car broke down. And the $100 that I was going to give to you, I had to use to have my car repaired or something like that, right? But once again, it presupposes there's some kind of common standard that we can appeal to evaluate the behavior of others, but also to justify our own departures from that moral law. So Lewis wants to say, therefore, that there must be some sort of common standard of moral judgment. And what he does is he calls this several things. I'm going to refer to one of his ways that he calls it because I think it's the best. He calls it the law of human nature. So let me say just a word about what he means by that. He'll say more about it in chapter 3. So by the law of human nature, what Lewis means is something like this. He means that you and I are creatures such that we are capable of behaving in certain ways, right? And one of the ways that we're capable of behaving of is we're capable of evaluating situations and making moral judgments, right? That's what it means to be a human being, right? People who can't do that we call sociopaths, right? And we put them away because they're generally dangerous. So the idea here is that Lewis wants to say that there's kind of a law of human nature in such a way that you and I have a kind of a capacity to think morally, to make moral judgments, and to act morally. That's the law of human nature. And Lewis says that's not something that's specifically Christian. Morality is something that's not only available to Christians. That's, I think, self-evidently true because there are some Christians, right, who don't act very morally at all. And we hear about them with great frequency. Now, I'm going to insert a footnote here. Lewis doesn't say this, but just kind of by way of filling in some background. Lewis is drawing on a long tradition of Christian moral thought. That is, what we're getting here is not C.S. Lewis's original idea, and he recognizes this, right? There's a long tradition of Christian moral thought that says something like this. Because you and I were created in the image of God, and because all human beings were created in the image of God, right? As human beings, we possess the ability to think and act in a moral way. That's part of the equipment that God has given us. So this explains why morality is not confined to Christians. It's something that's part of who we are as creatures of God. So that's a little footnote there. Now, another thing that Lewis says here that's really important is, and he kind of brings up a sort of a situation from his own context. So remember, it's 1941. Britain is facing Germany alone. France has been conquered. England's being bombed. And Lewis says, if there's no such thing as sort of like an objective moral law, then it's very difficult to argue that what's going on in Germany is somehow wrong. And Lewis was addressing a very real situation. That is, we just want to realize, right? It's really important to realize that in England, there actually were people who strongly sympathized with the Nazi movement. They really thought that it was the right way to go. And of course, we now know that one of those people was the man who abdicated from being King Edward VI. He was a strong Nazi sympathizer, right? And that there was a strong sort of strain of sympathy for what the Nazis were doing in Britain. Another sort of group of people essentially said this. Well, this whole business of democracy and human rights, that's part of who we are as English people, but that's not part of the Germans' heritage. We have our way of doing things, and they have their way of doing things, and who are we to sort of impose our beliefs and values on them? And if they don't want democracy, who are we to tell them they need it? And if they want to decide that, there are certain people they want to eliminate, that's sort of the way they do things over there. That's their business. So Lewis says, if there's no actual objective moral law, there's no way to evaluate that situation. There's no way to say, this really is wrong. This isn't how people should be treated. So if there's no objective moral law, then the situation's going to be very different, very difficult indeed. Now, another thing that Lewis says here in the first chapter is he begins to address a kind of an objection to his view. And in chapter 2, he addresses two major objections, which hopefully we'll have time to see. So Lewis says, somebody's going to pipe up and say, but you know what? In the history of humankind, people have sort of had all different kinds of moralities. They've believed in all kinds of different things. And Lewis says, no, if you look at that claim, it collapses under analysis. So here's a quote from chapter 1. I only need to ask the reader to think what a totally different morality would mean. Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. Men have differed as regards to what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only to your own family or to your fellow countrymen or to everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. So Lewis is going to want to say, look, you know what? That idea that there have been some radically different moralities really is not true. Think about a society, right, where a sort of pathological liar was held up as an example. Or think about a society where, as Lewis is, right, being a coward was thought to be a good thing. Or think about a society where somehow it was thought that, the more people you double-crossed and the more people you stabbed in the back, that was the ideal form of behavior. Lewis says that we don't find such a place. What we do find, Lewis says, is this. We find that as we look at various societies, and we'll come back to this, when we finish book 1, we're going to take a little pause, and we're going to take a look at Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, which is the only kind of book-length thing he wrote on the subject of morality. So we'll be coming back to this. But anyway, Lewis says what we find is this. We find that there is a sort of common set of moral principles throughout all human societies, and that what we find is we just find those principles being applied differently. Okay, so let's take this example of, you should always treat other people well. Okay, that seems to be a common moral principle. Now, in some societies, that's going to be applied to very few people, right? The only people you really need to treat well are like your own sort of family. Everybody else, well, they're open season. Or you should actually treat everyone in your, in your sort of community well, and beyond that, it's open season. Or even beyond that, getting toward a more Christian perspective. Actually, no, it's your obligation to treat everyone well. So what Lewis is going to say here is, he's going to say, it's not that there really are like radically different moralities. Rather, what we're going to find is we're going to find a common set of moral principles which are applied differently in different societies. And the thing here is, right, once again, if there's no objective moral standard, then there's no way of judging how these principles are going to be applied, right? So maybe to draw kind of a little example from our own history, right? One way to look at the history of the United States, right, is to see that what's happened is that over time, right, we've sort of realized ways in which our own country has failed to live up to its own ideals. Right? So when the Constitution was written, it in effect implicitly acknowledged the existence of slavery. Right? As time went on, that was generally seen as a bad thing, and we had to fight a civil war to end it. And then as time went on, right, we actually saw that there were these kind of vast inequalities in society, and that leads to the era of sort of civil rights legislation. Right? So one way to see this is to say that we've been operating with a kind of fundamental moral principle. All citizens have a kind of fundamental equality. And what's been happening over time is we've been applying that principle more and more consistently. Okay, that's the idea. Once again, if there's no moral principle that's not subjective, it's impossible to evaluate moral progress, or moral progress doesn't exist. Okay, there's nothing to measure it by. Now, a little concluding comment here before we go to chapter 2, and that is just a little thought here. What Lewis is doing in chapter 1 is he's trying to get us to think about the nature of morality itself. And I think what he's going to do is, and we'll see this when we get to the section on Christian morality, which is book 3. Lewis is going to want to help us to see this. He's going to want us to see that many people, Christians and non-Christians, have kind of like a wrong understanding of morality. Many people think of morality as essentially a system of rules which kind of limits our freedom, right? We have this idea that somehow, right, morality is a kind of system of rules, and on one hand, you're supposed to think well of it, but on the other hand, you don't like it because it limits your freedom, okay? Now, Lewis used a wonderful image to describe this kind of situation. He says, imagine a children's playground that's located right on the edge of a kind of a fairly steep cliff. And a fence is put up around the playground so the children don't fall over the cliff. And he says, you know what? The fence actually, right, does limit the children's freedom. The fence robs the children of their freedom to fall off the cliff. But losing your freedom to fall off a cliff is not such a bad thing, right? That is, there's a sense in which, right, freedom can be misused and abused. And so we have to be careful about how we think about freedom. But anyway, Lewis's point here is simply this: that what morality really is, it's not just simply a series of rules that interferes with our freedom, but rather what morality really is about is guiding us to actually being fully and truly human. In Christian language, right, what morality is about is guiding us to actually fully embody the image of God. And I think we'd all want to agree, right, that the problem with lying and cheating and stealing and gossiping and murder and greed, right, is if you engage in those things, it's really hard for you to be advertising the image of God, right? That's the idea here. So Lewis is going to want to say, and he'll bring this up in book 3, that the purpose of morality actually isn't to sort of stifle our freedom, but actually to give us real freedom. That's a really important point. Okay, a quick tour of chapter 2, and then we'll stop. So in chapter 2, Lewis deals with two objections to what he said in chapter 1. And the thing I think that's interesting about both the objections is they're still with us. Okay, so both the objections that he deals with, and these are actually objections that people had written to him about. Okay, so it's kind of like today, somebody's on the radio or on the television, they say something and, a flood of mail comes in telling them how they were wrong, right? And so Lewis got all this mail from his first broadcast. And so two objections are raised to what he says in his first talk. So let's take a look at both of them. The first objection that Lewis deals with that he got was something that kind of goes like this. But Professor Lewis, there's really no such thing as a moral law. What really guides our actions is instinct. Notice the point there, right? That is, the point here is, no, all this fine thought about morality and people acting on moral principles and making moral judgment, that's all like folderol. What really motivates us, this person or these people said, was that we really operate on the basis of instinct, and that's where all what you call morality comes from. So let's take a look at that. There are different ways that you could sort of think about this objection. And like I said, it's still with us today. Essentially, this view comes down to the view that basically all morality is really a function of biology. That is, all the things that we now call our sort of moral behaviors are actually simply functions of our sort of evolutionary history, right? We want to look out for members of the human race because we sort of have an instinct of, preserving those like us and, cooperating, and those who cooperate are those most likely to succeed, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So that's the idea here, that all morality basically comes down to biology and finally is a matter of instinct. Now, Lewis replies to this by saying something like this. He says, that view doesn't really make any sense, because what happens when you find yourself in a situation where you're having to deal with conflicting instincts? Okay, let's say St. Peter's is on fire, okay, and you know that I'm somehow trapped in the building, and now you've got a decision to make. Do I go back into St. Peter's to rescue poor Michael Petty? Or do I keep running and save myself? Okay, that's your decision. I'm not going to speculate about where you're coming out on that. But anyway, notice what Lewis's point here is. Lewis's point is just simply this, right? In almost any given situation, we're going to find ourselves with conflicting desires about different things. The question is, how do you decide among those? But Lewis's point here is this, that there has to be something in us that's independent of instincts that allows us to make judgments between those instincts. So let me just sort of trace out a scenario here. Let's say you're in the process of running away from St. Peter's, and then all of a sudden you think, oh no, wait a minute. Michael Petty may not be like the greatest person in the world. But he's done a few good things. And so I'm going to run back in there and see if I can pull him out of the building. Now, of course, that's a moral judgment, right? You're going to now risk your life to save me from the burning St. Peter's. And this is Lewis's point, right? Lewis says that one of the things that enables us actually to be moral is that we're not simply driven or dominated by instinct. That is the point here, right? Is if all that's going on within us are instincts, if all our behavior really is instinctual, it's impossible to talk about morality at all, right? Because morality presupposes at least two things. Morality presupposes some degree of freedom by which we choose our actions, and morality presupposes a judgment about right and wrong. Absent those two things, you can't talk about morality. Okay? Just like, when your new puppy, wets on the living room carpet, you don't call the puppy immoral. Okay? Your puppy didn't sort of make a conscious moral choice to wet your new carpet. The puppy just did what puppies do, right? With human beings, hopefully it's different. So that's the first thing. The second objection is this. The second objection that gets voiced to Lewis is this. Oh no, Professor Lewis, you have all this high-minded talk about morality and this sort of thing. Actually, all morality basically is simply social convention, right? All morality is simply a matter of our society sort of schooling us to do certain things and to not do other things. So for example, if this is true, right? The only reason why we dislike theft is because our society has taught us that theft is a bad thing. There might be a society where theft was thought to be good. And those sort of societies are called kleptocracies, right? Governments that are based on stealing, a kleptocracy. So let's see how Lewis responds to this. So the accusation, right, is, once again, morality really doesn't exist. Basically, what all morality really is, it's sort of social convention. And once again, right, this goes back to Lewis's own situation. Look, in Germany, they have one set of social conventions, and over here in England, we have another. We've got our way of doing things, they've got their way of doing things, and just let's let everybody live in harmony, and you do your thing, and I'll do mine, okay? Of course, unfortunately, they found out, right, that the people who were left to do their own thing decided that they wanted to do their own thing across the whole world, right? So that's when things got difficult. Let's take a look at how Lewis responds to this. First of all, Lewis says that this actually can't be true. In this sense, right, if all morality is simply social convention, if all moral issues come down to simply what our society has taught us or what our society thinks good, once again, moral judgment becomes impossible. If all morality is just simply what a given people does in a given place, it's impossible to make moral judgments, right? There's going to be those situations where we find ourselves in conflict with our society, right? There may be points where we say, well, no, wait a minute. Although this society teaches this, I think it's wrong. And the question is, well, on what basis? On what basis are you going to argue that that's actually the case? So once again, Lewis says, the problem with the idea of morality simply being a matter of social convention is, once again, it basically does away with the whole idea of morality. Okay, so both the idea of morality as a matter of instinct and morality as a matter of social norms or social convention. Basically, it's not, neither of these things are simply different forms of morality. They actually do away with it. Okay? It destroys it and makes moral judgment impossible. Now, as I said, it's important to realize that both these two views are actually still very much around. They didn't like die away in the 1940s or something like this. They're still very much around us. And they kind of have updated versions, but it's important, I think, to realize that they're still with us in many ways. So let's just stop just a minute and see, we've got some time for questions. Let's just see where Lewis is kind of leaving us here before he takes us on to chapter 3. Lewis is trying to get us to think about ourselves, right? And he's done it, I think he's doing it in a sort of subtle way. He's trying to get us to think about what kind of creatures we are. And whether, right, these other ways of describing us seem to be accurate. Okay? Let me give you an example here to test the two theories that Lewis is arguing against here. Let's say that we know a man named John, and John has a really successful career. He works for a hedge fund in Manhattan, and he's really successful. He's rising in the hedge fund. Probably will end up as president or chairman of the board or something like that. And John decides to take 2 years off from that job, undoubtedly diminishing his promotion prospects, to care for his dying father. Okay, so that's what John's done. So now you and I are talking about John because we really admire John. So let's test these two things out. So I say to you, you know what? I really admire John. He's thoroughly following his biological instincts. Isn't that great? Don't you think it's impressive how much John's biological instincts have dominated his life? And you're going to look at me and say, I probably can't repeat exactly what you're going to say to me, but I think you would probably look at me with some sort of like puzzlement and basically say, what on earth are you talking about? Right? Scenario number 2. Once again, we're talking about John, and I said to you, you know what? I really admire John. Imagine he's so conformed to social convention that he's taking care of his dying father. Once again, that sounds really odd, doesn't it? On the other hand, right, if I said to you something like, you know what, I really admire John. He clearly has a sense of priority in his life. He recognizes that his duty to his father outweighs his vocation, and he has sacrificially walked in to doing what he conceives of his moral duty. I really, really admire John. Now, I'm hoping that you'll see that the third scenario is the best. Okay, but that's the point that Lewis is trying to make. Okay, Lewis is simply trying to make the point that the sort of the traditional Christian description of who we are as moral creatures makes far, far, far more sense of things than the alternatives. And that's going to lead us to ask a question next, right? That's going to lead us to ask the question, okay, well, where does this sense of moral obligation come from? If we didn't invent it, if it's not simply a product of biology or social conditioning or something like that, where did it come from? It clearly has to have come beyond you and I. Where's that source? Okay, so that's where we'll leave it for this morning. Any questions about what we've covered thus far? I realize I've just turned on the fire hose and hosed you all down. But questions? Okay, just like you to keep this little image in mind as we move to chapter 3. In chapter 3, Lewis is going to argue against another objection to what he said, which is the idea that morality is simply a matter of social utility. So that's what Father Bill will take on that next week. And then in chapter 4, Lewis is going to push to have us look, well, what's behind the moral law? Just sort of keep this idea in your mind. Lewis is wanting us, I think, to kind of go on something of an intellectual adventure. And we'll come back to this too when we finish the first book. Is it possible to kind of create a sort of a list of things which we would expect to be true if a good and gracious and righteous God existed? And some of the things in that catalog might be something like this. Well, we've looked at one of them, right? The existence of an objective morality. A second thing, right, would be a sort of an ordered, purposeful universe. That's another thing we would expect, right? A third thing we might expect is we would probably expect the reality of beauty. Beauty isn't just sort of pretty stuff. There actually seems to be some greater reality that's actually behind it. Okay. Anyway, what we're going to take a look at when we finish book 5, and I don't know either whether will it be Father Bill or I that's going to do this, but anyway, we'll get to it. There's a kind of a student of C.S. Lewis. His name is Alistair McGrath. And we're going to take a look at an article that McGrath wrote, just a word about him, so you can, this is sort of like in the movies where they give you previews of coming attractions, only instead of giving you 15 coming attractions, I'm only going to give you one. Alistair McGrath went to Oxford, and he was working on a PhD in molecular biology. And at the time that he went to Oxford, he was an atheist. He became an atheist in high school. And as a result of his work in molecular biology, and as a result, he gets his PhD, he begins this sort of very prestigious research project, which has all kinds of government funding and whatnot. And in the midst of all that, he becomes a Christian, largely through reading C.S. Lewis's works. And Lewis, the article that we're going to take a look at is actually from a speech or a talk that McGrath gave to PhD students in the sciences at Oxford about why he became a Christian. Okay, to finish up the story, Alistair McGrath is kind of one of these awful underachievers. So after only getting a PhD in molecular biology from Oxford, he then went on and got a PhD in theology from Oxford, and now teaches theology at Oxford. So, he's one of these people who kind of needs to get his act together and do a little bit more with his life. But anyway, we'll take a look at that. I think you'll find it really interesting to see what McGrath says to these students. So next week, if all goes well, if the building doesn't burn down, we'll take a look at chapters 3 and 4 of Mere Christianity. And now a word from our sponsor.